there's a reason that it's called truth and reconciliation, right? Um, I think any decent person would want there to be reconciliation. And that's a pretty loaded word, which I'll probably do an entire show on what reconciliation really means. But there are pre-existing conditions that come into play when it comes to restoration, healing, reconciliation. Well, there's a pre-existing condition. There's something that created the situation uh, before it can be reconciled. And the other thing you need when there's reconciliation is truth. And the truth, if there's no truth, there is no reconciliation. Now, a few people have reiterated that today online. I've seen that. And we have to make sure, though, that when we say truth, we don't just mean my beliefs over yours or winning. And I think even though a lot of those who have been talking about, truth and reconciliation today, they really mean their side winning. Now, do I want my side to win? I have a side. And that's the whole point about me getting up on here, speaking, just like so many are in the media and that sort of thing. I have a perspective, obviously, or I wouldn't be here. But what I can promise you that I will, what I seek to do here is to be introspective, which means what you're going to get from this channel and from me is from the inside out, right? So my intention here is not to perform for you or to entertain. My intention in this channel is actually to share with you some of the collective knowledge that I've gained over the years. I just celebrated a birthday um, back in December 26th. Yeah. I mean, I know my birthday. It's the day after Christmas. I'm that kid. This is your birthday present, and oh yeah, it's and Christmas present too. Yeah. I'm not bitter. Actually, and honestly, I don't even think about it at all. And I have such a beautiful family now that I live with, and even in this COVID and everything, it's been actually a beautiful time in many ways. It's not been easy, uh, like all of you know, but in some ways we've had some wonderful moments. So I'm very grateful for all the subscribers that have come today. And I'm grateful for my family, my birthday, and I'm almost 50 years old. So my point that I was getting to just now was that with almost a half a century under my belt, I've been taking stock of a lot of things over the last few years, and I've been thinking about how I've lived my life and where I want things to go. So, whether it's the midway point or less, or, it'll make you start to think. And so I've always been a reflective person, but I haven't always been a person who has tried to peer into the future and at least make some solid projections. I've never been a plotter or a planner in that sense, to my detriment, right? So part of the show is for me to share my experiences, but also to share some of the collective wisdom. And so what does that look like? So currently, I moved from the Hawaii, where I was a secondary English school teacher. Beautiful place, of course, beautiful people. I loved my job. So why did I leave it? I left it because there's been something that's been nagging at me for a long time. And that is, I've wandered a lot in my life. And so that is why some of my subscribers, they signed up from all the way back in my childhood from Beloit, Wisconsin, where I grew up, which is about an hour south of Madison, 2 hours north of Chicago. And I also did my undergraduate work there at Beloit College, which is a small liberal arts school. And so some of the subscribers, it was just kind of neat to see that those who were signing up for the channel were coming from like all these uh, different geographic locations and time periods of my life, and all of them were represented in today's little um, our little reaching our little goal of 100 subscribers. So going back to Beloit, was a huge uh, part of my formation in my life. My undergraduate work in religious studies and journalism, and initially I was an anthropology major, so I had some of that under my belt. And then I saw some subscribers from my California years. I spent 12 years in California teaching, working in journalism, uh, working in the e-commerce world right before the big internet bubble busted back in the early 2000s. I mean, I was part of all of those things, and you don't think much about it when you're going through it. But now as I reflect, we had a big momentous week this week, and I reflect back on on my life, and I realize I do have some wisdom to bring to this world in this situation. And one of them is going to require a little bit more sustained effort on all of our parts, sustained effort and sincerity in how we engage in dialogue, how we engage with our media. So I'm going to fast forward and then I'll fill in the middle later. But where I am currently is in Columbia, Missouri. And I am at the University of Missouri at Columbia, and I'm working on a PhD in something called Language and Literacies for Social Transformation, which is in the College of Education. And so essentially, a lot of what I look at is how we understand the subject that we often call English, for example. Now, most of you are going to be thinking things like literature and Shakespeare and things like that, and that's part of it. But really, it's about how we understand the world, how we read the world, how it is that we frame things through language. And what does that have to do with, say, an explosive event that happened last week? I would say everything. And so when we talk about rhetoric, when we talk about how we perceive messages, how our identities are formed, how our ideologies, these are all part of the same subject. So you can take even a subject like English and actually come to learn that, you know, it undergirds a lot of our understanding of the world. The Paulo Freire is was one of the first critical theorists, and he used the phrase, we have to become readers of the word and the world. And it might be flipped, I can't remember. And what he meant by what that is, you know, how we see the world is often shaped, of course, by our context, by forces of issues of power that are in our lives. So it's a complicated thing, and we are complicated beings. So what I was just talking about over on Facebook Live was if at an individual level we are complicated beings, like how many of us can truly say that we understand ourselves, right? Whenever there's conflict in a relationship, you know, on the romantic side, it's usually like, you know, two individuals trying to like sync up, right? But we're complicated beings, and you know, and that's where conflict begins. And so a breakup occurs when people can't overcome that conflict, or whether they realize actually in that interaction they want something else. Well, this is true both in you know, romantic relationships, but also at a societal level. And we are in a very complicated relational web. And that is what society is, especially in a pluralistic one, and one that's part of such a massive structure of power known as the United States. If you think about it, you think about, you know, all cultures have conflict, just as families have conflict. Um, and so how things play out are relative to the structures that are around them. In this sense, culture, right? So a family has a culture. You have your individual perspectives and ideology that are shaped by those forces. Now, why am I getting all theoretical? Well, I am a product of my environment. I am a product of all of my experiences. I'm nearly 50 years old. I just went on an incredible journey living in several different states. In California, I lived in Los Angeles. I lived in San Francisco, and I lived in Fresno, California, before moving to Colorado, where I lived there for 10 years and met incredible people. I'm thinking about these places because I'm thinking about the people that I met in these places, all of whom were representative in those who subscribed to the channel today. So in Denver, Colorado, I'm thinking of my good friend, Laura, who I used to play music with and worked in the yoga community with. playing music and doing meditation and spiritual retreats and things like that together. I think about those places and I think about what did I learn and how was my identity shaped in each of these places, right? So I've lived in lots of places. I've lived in Denver for about 10 years. And then I moved to Houston, Texas for a couple years. And as a teacher, I was working there. And that's when I decided I was going to take the big trip over to Hawaii. I'm going to be producing a video on whether or not people should consider being a teacher in Hawaii. Maybe some of that sounds good to some of you teachers. You know, what would it be like to like sip Mai Tais on the beach or something or other? And I can tell you from my experiences, you know, might be able to give you some wisdom on whether that would be a good move for you or a disastrous one. And for many, it's a disastrous one. But for the right people, it can work out. My concern is not necessarily how much you like Hawaii, although that's part of it. It's, are you, if you're a teacher, that means you're a person of service. Are you going to be there to serve the population that's there or the population that you project that you think you want it to be? And that's a big barrier, and it's one that I'm very concerned with because I love the children, especially the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli, the Native Hawaiians, and then the other populations that came there to work, you know, sugar plantations. And there's a history there that's very complicated. So just like everything else, and that's my point of these videos, is that how do we engage in this web of relationships in these complications? Hello, Robert. I see you there. That's great. Speaking of web of relationships, Robert is a dear bishop in my church tradition, whom I met in Fresno, California. So we're talking about all these places and things that happen. The last thing I'll say on that Hawaiian issue is that, you know, it has to be a good match if you're going to move there, if you really are going to live there. And so I'll be having a video specifically related to that topic, even though it's not my main topic on this channel, coming up pretty soon. So that'll be an interesting one to see how people react to that. In Hawaii, I learned an incredible amount, both on the spiritual level, on the societal and cultural levels. And when I decided to move back to the mainland, I realized it's time now at this point in my life to put some things to work. For many years, I wouldn't do certain things because I felt I didn't know enough. I have to wait. Nope. I just have to read 10 more books on this subject. I just have to, achieve this in education. Then I'll be ready, to share the things I know. And then I realized how foolish that is. In education, for example, there's something called the banking model. I referenced Paulo Freire earlier. The banking model of education, which is the prevalent one of traditional education, and that is the teacher knows all and deposits their knowledge into these empty cups, these empty vessels called the students. So the information comes from the teacher and is deposited into the student. That's not how life works at all. That is not how, and it completely negates the concept of relationship when it comes to teaching and learning. And I mention that because it has direct connotations or direct connections to what I'm about to say in a few minutes about where we're going to be needing to move forward as a society. And these quick fix answers that you're hearing on the media right now are not where it's at. And I really love this medium, except for one reason, as I have to put on my old man glasses to see what's going on. And Robert says, we move with cultural sensitivity when engaging with people. Absolutely. And authenticity. And that's actually exactly where I was going with this is today I'm celebrating 100 subscribers to this channel. My goal by the end of the week is 1K. So to have 1,000, and that purpose is not necessarily to be, it's not for self-gain. It is how do we, because I'm going to go with what Robert just said here, how do we move with cultural sensitivity and engaging with people? Well, if we're not in tune with ourselves and we're not engaged with ourselves and think about why we think the way we do, this would be fall under the category of epistemology, how we know what we know. When we don't think of our own positionality and privilege, for example, then how can we engage authentically with the world when we don't even perceive ourselves correctly, right? And relationship is where that knowledge is established. Many years ago, I thought about being a monastic and wanting to hide out in a cave for the rest of my life, because I did find so much value in some of the spiritual wisdoms of the East and in meditation and some of the incredible insights that come that way. Um, but but how is it that I could achieve so much in those states of meditation and awareness, but when it came to my relationships, they weren't that great, and I think I was always a caring individual and I was a thoughtful individual, but uh, you can find out the integrity and authenticity of yourself in the quality and integrity of your relationships. That's what I'm figuring out in my old age. Now, so I've got an incredible amount of theory that I've gained over the course of my life, being in different contexts, different cultural contexts, and being widely exposed to a wide variety of intellectual information. I'll give you a quick little example, and then I got to go eat dinner. Um, uh, so currently we have a big mess, right? And I've been talking about this big mess for the first few videos of this channel. I've been talking about false messaging, distorted messaging, intentionally manipulative means of communication in, say, the prophetic movement, which I was calling the Trump prophets. Well, you can think about those things, and then you can think about why people do that in the first place. So those are two separate questions, and it has to do with this complicated conversation. That's how I look at this whole situation we're in, is a complicated conversation. But a conversation takes participants. So going back to the idea of truth and reconciliation, right now there's a lot of talk about reconciliation and moving on, and so Democrats probably have high aspirations that Joe Biden's president, so now everything's resolved. Some are a little less naive, and they realize that the problems, that we're not out of the woods yet um, with this violence. Some are even wiser, and they will say it doesn't even matter if the Democrats are in control, because there's all these other larger looming problems in the world, and in with the issues of power, and the Democrats have not solved that in the past, and they're certain to probably not solve them in the near future. So what does this mean? Well, it means we have to have a different kind of conversation if we're going to solve the problems that are facing us right now. And this is where I think that I can bring some clarity to the table in bringing in some of the theory that doesn't get put into practice very much. Now, there's one theorist, I'll mention two tonight and then sign off. One of the theorists, his name is Jürgen Habermas. Now, Habermas is a famous scholar out of what's called the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Those of you who've taken courses, in social theory, you know who I'm talking about. Jürgen Habermas says the way that we need to move society is in consensus building. We have to be able to agree on at least some basic stuff. And one of those basic elements is, how do we talk to each other? How do we communicate with one another? And so Habermas was looking for something called an ideal speech situation. That means, how can we bring, it's like mediation. How can we bring different parties together and through a agreed upon process beforehand, come together and, with, even though we have differences of opinion and everything, come to a sense of fairness, and everybody feels heard. Okay, that sounds pretty good. It sounds a lot like democracy. It sounds a lot like the ideals of what, for example, in the United States, a constitutional democracy would be all about. It sounds great. So where's the problem? The problem breaks down when all of the parties involved are not necessarily coming to the table being sincere, or they're coming to the table with their view of how things should be without any sort of idea of compromise. Now, there is no relationship on earth that works that way. So unless you are a child who has no concept, and children even understand this, that they have to establish compromise, and it's in the relationship that consensus is built, not necessarily in the procedure itself. And here's where theory breaks down. So if you, on an individual level, are coming to the table with any sort of distortions, be they your own misunderstandings of things or of others, or of yourself, you've automatically introduced into the situation a distortion, what I call distorted communication. And so if that happens on an individual level and then it happens on a macro level, it's going to reverberate in that way. So really, we're looking at something much deeper than just these sound bites that we're inundated with on a day-to-day basis. So a channel like this, and what I want to bring to the table, is a more robust conversation, and it takes a little work. It's not easy. It's not something that you can like digest in like a sound bite. And the sad truth is, we will not get to that place. Now, traditional cultures, they understood this. They understood, and this is why elders were respected in traditional cultures, is because the people understood that wisdom is something that is cultivated and delivered through the process of culture. But when you live in a pluralistic society, this becomes harder to maintain. And so people will look for quick fixes. This is why we see things like, not just because they're racist or whatever, but this is why you see things like the Proud Boys, or these different white nationalist organizations and that sort of thing, because they don't have the answers of how to deal with a pluralistic society. They only have the answers of what they want for themselves, and that is to maintain being the culture of power. And that's their only interest. So coming to the table is not something that's realistic for a group that has at its basis our way or the highway, that sort of thing. And so what they will do is they will use their distorted communication to approach another group that is not part of the culture of power, and they will actually heap accusations upon that other group that really are about themselves. Because when another group asserts itself and its own identity, it's met with, well, you're making this all about you, And so that's just one example, and there are many, of how communication breaks down. The key, though, in the bottom line is that sincerity is necessary. And so if any party is insincere at any point, it no longer is an ideal speech situation. Again, referring back to the social theorist Jürgen Habermas. Okay, so he had this idea, this wonderful idea, that a society could come together as long as the procedures were followed and fairness and validity claims were made in a certain way, that conflicts could be resolved somehow constitutionally. Okay, it's a great idea, but we've never seen it in practice. There has never been a point where everyone's been equally represented, and that sort of thing. And so, so what I'm getting at here is that you can't have an ideal speech situation and a perfect, communicative action, theory of communicative action, where deliberative democracy, where everyone comes together and they're able to agree. That's actually, it's not possible because of another theorist that I will mention now, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, whom I don't like to read that much, but I find his ideas very useful. And so recently, in one of the research articles I wrote, I put Jürgen Habermas in conversation with Michel Foucault. Now, Foucault is important because he's saying, you guys can do all this deliberative democracy all you want. Hi, Jennifer. You can try to seek consensus all you want, but it's all about power. And it's about issues of power. It's about structures of power. Power is everywhere, says Foucault. And because of power, you are not able to reach the consensus that you want because there are pre-existing conditions that are in place before you even get to the table. Okay. So while Jürgen Habermas will want to set up this idealistic environment where everyone's equally representative, Foucault will say in the real world, that is actually not how it works. That doesn't mean give up on it. It just means be real about the situation. Not everybody's getting an equal voice. And so there's always going to be an asymmetrical aspect of communication, meaning you can take this all the way down. I mean, I always like to take this down to like the individual level. Okay, so you in a relationship with another person, there are always issues of power involved. In any relationship, there are issues of power. Now, one way that Foucault is often misinterpreted is they're looking at power as a negative thing. So if you're a critical theorist like myself tends to be, you're generally looking at structures of in which power is consolidated, right, and become oppressive. And how do we fight, those powers? How do you rage against the machine? Well, so that's one way to look at power, but that's not Foucault is not saying that. Foucault is saying that power is everywhere. And so there are positive aspects of power just as much as there are negative ones. We tend to focus on the negative ones, but just look at the word empowerment, right? To be empowered means a positive aspect of acquiring agency. Agency meaning your ability to freely act upon a situation to change it, right? So things like that. So if you take this conversation of Jürgen Habermas, who talks about the ideal speech situation and deliberative democracy, and then you take Foucault, who says you have to, if you don't talk about power, you're always going to have distorted communication, right? These two theorists do not agree with one another. It may not even be possible to bring them together entirely. What does that have to do with our situation here and why I'm doing this channel? Because what we can do, though, is glean from the knowledge of these two things and then apply them to our situation. And this takes work. It takes work to do. And there's no teacher, as I said before, because there is power in every relationship. So if a teacher has all the power and perceives the situation as they have the wisdom and they're depositing it in into the student who's an empty vessel, it's not dialogical. Dialogical means that there's a relationship and there's a reciprocal process between teacher and student in which both are learning. And to accomplish that, there has to be a sense of intentional humility on the point of from the part of the teacher, who inevitably is going to be put in a position of power because of the context of the situation, right? Now, this plays out on all levels of society. And if you hang with me on this thought, it'll make sense into where I'm going to apply it in just a second. And then I got to go eat dinner. Hello, Jennifer. So in the religious realm, who has the power, for example? Generally, it's going to be the priesthood. If you're in the Catholic Church, there's a very hierarchy of where the power is and how it's consolidated. In individual, like other kinds of churches, it's usually the pastor or the priest. And if you've looked at my videos recently on the prophetic, the Trump prophecies and that kind of thing, this would be located in the prophet who tells the people basically what their reality should be. And when it doesn't line up, a lot of dangerous stuff happens, as we just saw last week. And we're not out of the woods yet. We'll be talking about that in tomorrow's show. All right. So we take these ideas of power and communication, and we're going to apply them to the current situation. The current situation is you have insincere participants who don't want dialogue. They just want power. And that's not going to solve anything. Sometimes power has to be met with power. And as we just saw, one group tried to exert its power upon the other, and because they are told that they will only be able to achieve this through power. Now, you take someone like a Donald Trump, who got up there and was saying those things. You can't be weak. You have to do it with power. And cleverly enough, he is emancipated, or he's like immune from being prosecuted. Maybe not, but I've talked to some lawyers on this, and it seems like you won't be able to catch him on inciting a riot, for example, which I believe he's guilty of. And I believe Senator Josh Hawley is guilty of, for their intentional, distorted communication, taking advantage of the emotions of people, making them feel powerless and that they have to do something, right? They have to make this reality that is crumbling all around them, right? So that kind of inflammatory rhetoric, is it inciting a riot or not? And so next week on the Proximity Portal podcast, I am going to be joined by an attorney who is knowledgeable in these matters, and we're going to have that discussion. So you'll want to stick around for that. Please share this channel. I'm in celebration right now of my first 100 subscribers. I want to get to 100K by the end of this week. We're going to bring some really robust, really strong arguments that are going to take a little bit of work on your part, but together we can create strategic points of resistance to this poor communication that's going on in this world, poor thinking that's going on in this world, and actually, overcome it together with humility, right? So my name is Avi Penhollow. This is the Proximity Portal. You know what to do. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time. Thank you.